Good morning. Welcome to the August 1st, 2018 land use hearing. I'll now call to order the meeting. A public hearing to consider a legislative text amendment to the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan and Zoning and Development Ordinance related to the accessory dwelling units. Before we begin, I'll invite you to rise and join me in a Pledge of Allegiance. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Today we'll consider ZDO 269, which is a legislative text amendment to the Clackamas County Comprehensive Plan, Zoning, and Development Ordinance that proposes to expand opportunities for accessory dwelling units in unincorporated portion of Clackamas County and allows for a new class of accessory historic dwellings in specific areas under specific circumstances. The hearing on ZDO 269 will proceed as follows. We'll first hear a representative from the planning, Glenn Hamburg from Alaska. Next, I will open the hearing for public testimony, beginning with public officials who will have 5 minutes each. Then representatives from recognized community planning organizations and agencies will have 3 minutes each. And finally, other people wishing to testify will also have 3 minutes each. The board will then deliberate and either render a decision today or set the time to make a decision at a later date. Assisting us in the hearing today is our clerk, Kevin Moss, Martha Fritzie, and Glenn Hamburg from our Planning and Zoning Division, and Assistant City Counsel Nate Boderman. If you wish to testify, please fill out a green card and give it to Kevin. If you have a prepared or written statement, please give a copy to Kevin and use your time to summarize what you have written. Everyone who wishes to speak will have an opportunity to do so. We'll now hear from Martha. Glenn.
Good morning. Well, this screen is coming down. Again, Glenn Hamburg. I'm a planner too with Clackamas County's Planning Division, formerly from Alaska, but now proudly from Oregon City. And I'll be assisted here with Senior Planner Martha Fritzie. She can kick me under the table if I say anything wrong. So the proposal, as the chair mentioned, let me make sure I can get this.
It's not working.
Ta-da, thank you. The proposal is ZDO 269, and just to clarify, there may have been an error on the Board of County Commissioners webpage that was fixed yesterday that cited this package as ZDO 268. It is ZDO 269. And as the chair mentioned, it's a package of proposed legislative amendments to the county's comprehensive plan and the zoning and development ordinance. These amendments are broadly aimed at expanding opportunities for accessory dwellings in various parts of the county. The purpose of this package that includes 6 separate proposals that I'll summarize here is primarily to address a recent state mandate requiring that the county allow more ADUs in certain areas. It also aims to, by county choice, allow ADUs in some other areas of the county without a mandate. Its purpose is also to take advantage of a new state option to allow ADU-like structures in parts of the county that are not referenced by the above initiatives. There is an aim to increase the flexibility of ADU development for property owners. And then the package aims to provide some clarity and consistency to the existing ADU regulations. Briefly, I'll just mention some background items. So first, what is an accessory dwelling unit? An accessory dwelling unit is a fully separate dwelling unit on the same property as a primary dwelling. It will have its own kitchen and usually its own laundry facilities. Currently, accessory dwelling units are only allowed by the Zoning and Development Ordinance in the county's urban single-family residential zones. The ZDO also, however, allows for accessory dwelling units in one single-family residential zone up in the Mount Hood area. That's the Hoodland Residential District, the HR zone. Right now, the MRR zone, which is the Mountain Recreational Resort Zone, also up in Mount Hood, does not allow accessory dwelling units, despite that zone being another zone for detached single-family housing. The standards for ADUs in the county right now depend on the location. Depending on the location, an ADU's maximum size will change, whether or not there's an owner occupancy requirement, etc. Right now, manufactured dwellings are not allowed by the Zoning and Development Ordinance to be used as accessory dwelling units. And as I briefly mentioned, there's been recent state legislation that now requires the county to allow one accessory dwelling unit per legal detached single-family dwelling on any lot, and in more locations than the county currently authorizes by the ZDO. That state mandate is SB 1051 and House Bill 4031. It is indeed a mandate, and it applies only to those areas inside of urban growth boundaries. And it requires the county to allow, as I mentioned before, one accessory dwelling unit per detached single-family dwelling that may be on a property zoned for single-family housing in a UGB. Despite this mandate, the county is authorized by the legislation to adopt reasonable siting and design regulations. And ZDO 269 proposes some of those regulations. HB 3012 is an option. This measure allows, if the county chooses, for the county to permit accessory historic dwellings that I'll describe. It relates to areas only outside of an urban growth boundary and outside of an urban reserve. And it only relates to properties that are zoned for detached single-family housing as a primary use outright. So that would not include the EFU zone, the timber zone, or the ag forest zone. I'll describe this measure in more detail, but broadly it allows for the conversion of an existing home built between 1850 and 1945 to an accessory dwelling when a property owner builds a new detached single-family dwelling or sites a new manufactured dwelling on that same property. There are some restrictions to where this could occur in terms of zoning, but also in terms of the minimum lot size. So this package, ZDO 269, has 6 proposals. The main one is to implement that state ADU mandate, to amend the Zoning and Development Ordinance and the Comprehensive Plan to specifically allow one ADU per detached primary dwelling or manufactured dwelling, but only in those zones that allow for detached single-family housing outright and only inside of urban growth boundaries. The proposal would require these accessory dwelling units to be subject to the county's ADU standards. Implementing this mandate would expand where ADUs are allowed to include the FF10, FU10, RA1, RA2, and RRFF5 zones, but again, only inside of urban growth boundaries. This image here is just an example of the areas of the county that this mandate relates to. In yellow, you'll see those zones that this new mandate expands the ADU provisions for inside of urban growth boundaries. You can see that the majority of the affected area is up in the Damascus area. Staff estimates that there's maybe about 4,000 tax lots that could now qualify for an accessory dwelling unit. And about 55 to 60% of those tax lots are in the Damascus area.
Can you
Yes.
go back to that map? I just have a clarification. And so are what we're saying here is that because we currently allow ADUs, a little bit more restrictive, right? that the only areas impacted are outside, but we are loosening up within the unincorporated urban area. We are loosening up
Yes.
the restrictions currently on ADUs, but why isn't that really being talked about or displayed or mentioned right now?
Well,
As impacted,
sure.
the impact umbrella.
Sure. That's a good point. This map only illustrates the impacts of the expanded areas for allowing ADUs. It does not map any of the areas potentially affected by the other changes of ZDO 269. So to be clear, those yellow areas are only to identify the regions that have the zoning designation where the required amendments would now allow accessory dwelling units where they're not currently allowed by the ZDO today.
Right, but under one of those two, Senate bill or House bill, there are impacts in the unincorporated urban areas. Well, yeah, whether incorporated or unincorporated, because the cities have to do what they need to do. So are we, is this specifically because of one bill and not the other bill, or was notification given? Because I know there are concerns, I've heard concerns about impacts to unincorporated urban, for example, residential, as to adding more load on the road system and so forth.
Within the UGB of whatever area.
There you are. So it doesn't affect.
Can I jump in here? So this map was really just intended to be a reference, and perhaps it's named incorrectly. It's simply intended to represent the areas where ADUs would now be allowed where they were not allowed before. It's not intended to illustrate all of the impacts of any of the bills or of ZDO 269. But it's just a visual identification of where they will now be allowed, where they're not allowed before. Excuse me, I'm really hoarse.
Okay, so is it also fair to say, thank you, Martha, for that. Is it also fair to say that what we're discussing here today on loosening the restrictions in the unincorporated area, that virtually almost all of the residential zoning in the county is affected by what we're doing today?
Yes, I think that's fair.
Okay, thank you.
No, thank you for that. This package includes another measure. It proposes to repeal what is known as the owner occupancy requirement. And again, this is a requirement that the property owner either reside in their primary dwelling or their accessory dwelling unit. That's a requirement for having an ADU in the code today. And both the state's DLCD and the Planning Commission, as well as staff, are recommending the repeal of this owner occupancy requirement. The third proposal of the package is to increase the current maximum for most accessory dwelling unit sizes from 720 square feet to 900 square feet. So to be clear, in most all zones, the maximum floor area for an accessory dwelling unit is 720 square feet. The Planning Commission, when they met, recommended increasing that to 900 square feet in order to potentially allow for more flexibility for developers, and staff supports that. The fourth proposal is to allow manufactured dwellings as ADUs, but only in certain areas. Specifically, staff and the Planning Commission are recommending that we allow manufactured homes that fully meet applicable building code requirements in the FF10, RA1, RA2, and RRFF5 districts inside of an urban growth boundary. The proposal before you right now would not allow manufactured dwellings to serve as ADUs inside urban low-density residential zones. Whether the structure is quote-unquote stick-built or is a licensed manufactured dwelling, the structure would still need to meet the same square footage maximums that are applicable in the zone and meet building code requirements.
Is this the proper time to inject something here?
I'm happy to, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Chair. And I mentioned to staff when I was last week when this was introduced to us here on individual meetings. My confusion or concern about this one is that we allow manufactured housing under code on residential or urban currently. So someone can build a manufactured home. And the way this reads, and I think you confirmed that last week, is that you can build a manufactured home on a lot, on a residential lot, but in this case, you can actually have a situation where you have a manufactured home in a residential lot, but you can't build a manufactured ADU on the same lot. So that would be stick-built, conventional, versus manufactured. That part just baffles me as to why that is. And you all mentioned notice. And my last question is, if this is impacting the entire county, haven't we really given notice to the entire county, or would you just give notice to the area shaded on the map? There are two or three different questions in there, but they relate to one another.
Sure, I can just say a few words about noticing, and Martha can help me out if I'm missing something. We did send notice to all of the CPOs in the county, as well as to the cities and to affected property owners. In this case, that would mean those whose restrictions under the ZDO would increase. So, for example, up in the HR zone, this proposal includes amendments that would restrict what they could do in terms of having an ADU right now. So each of those property owners was officially notified. You're right that this proposal would not allow manufactured dwellings to serve as ADUs in the urban low-density residential zones. That's not to say it couldn't. We just didn't notify property owners and advertise that as a proposal, so we don't have any feedback on that right now yet. Right now, though, the zoning and development ordinance does require that manufactured dwellings be at least 1,200 square feet, I believe. 1,000 square feet in the urban low-density residential zones. So that would be a larger structure than is allowed for an accessory dwelling unit. I also just did some cursory research, and I couldn't find a jurisdiction in the metro region that allows manufactured dwellings to serve as accessory dwelling units right now.
Okay, so I have a question for Nate then, for legal. So if the requirement for notification is due or required when we're making things more restrictive, perfectly acceptable. I'm willing to accept that as a rationale. And therefore, allowing manufactured ADUs in urban environments would be less restrictive. So therefore, if notice has been adequately served for the restrictive aspects of this, we have the flexibility in the land use hearing, Nate, to add that or change that potentially, or consider that, correct?
Right. So we have a couple different requirements that we're working with. So there is a state law requirement when we are making something or making a zone more restrictive that we have to send out notice to each of the property owners. So that's where that is coming from. We also have a self-imposed restriction, you can say, through our own zoning code, which requires us to notify really for the substance of what we are proposing, and that comes from our own zoning code. And traditionally, we have sent notice to CPOs, to other government partners, other stakeholders, notifying them so they're apprised of what we are proposing here. So this would fall under that second category of notice. And so really what the risk would be if we were to add this, we're not making it more restrictive, so we're not running afoul of state law, but we would potentially be running afoul of our own policies, procedures, and code by adding something that we really haven't noticed for. The risk, as you suggest, is probably minimal, but what we've done in the past is to continue the hearing, to renotice, and so people would have the opportunity to be, again, apprised of that and be able to comment. Because what we're really, or what you'd be proposing to do really is adding a whole new category, right, of dwelling types to a zone, and that's not something that our CPOs have really been advised of. So that would be the risk, that would be the issue.
Yeah, well, it's not necessarily a foul, but it's, from what I've been tracking as these bills have been going through the legislature, that the legislative intent was to make more housing units available in the urban areas because of the housing crisis, to, as with the maximum size, basically make it lower cost. And it seems to me that to stick build something is a higher cost. Well, not seem, it is. And manufactured housing has a potential to reduce the cost in the entry level to achieve legislative intent. So it seems to me that maybe we're not necessarily a foul, but we're not it doesn't seem to me they were truly honoring the intent of trying to make it lower, bring in the entry level, lower cost elements of this. And we had a pretty large meeting that Martha and I and some of our staff in here attended here in Portland when the ADU thing was, the legislation was brought forth and all the different ways of interpreting that. And it seems like we're looking at this kind of narrowly, and I'm just kind of really wondering if we're really achieving the legislative intent by restricting it to stick-built.
Yeah, and that's certainly a policy question. You know, I'll note that under state law and our code, we treat stick-built and manufactured dwellings differently. I mean, there's fundamentally treated differently under those two sets of laws. And so, you know, whether it was the policy to include all of that in one, you know, that's not how we've proceeded. That's not really how, again, how state law and our local code treat those. And so I'd be more comfortable if we were to add that to again, either renotice that or give folks an opportunity to comment on that, or at least that would be my recommendation. Again, simply because traditionally through land use, stick-built and manufactured have been treated differently.
I just did my message to my colleagues. My message to my colleagues is I think that we might have a little bit of pushback, and I think as staff, I think what Nate's saying is that we might have to come back later to change that. But
So
that's something that we ought to be
What you're
considering.
saying is that if we allow ADUs, we have a restriction on manufactured homes that they'd be 1,200. So if the maximum is, whatever it was,
900.
900, we wouldn't allow manufactured homes to be an ADU.
So currently, our code specifically prohibits manufactured dwellings from being an accessory structure. There's also the size limit. So there's sort of two pieces that prohibit the manufactured dwelling from being an accessory dwelling unit right now in the urban low density areas. So the proposal was to allow them only in these new areas. The original proposal, when we first sent out notification, was to not make any changes in the urban low density residential areas for accessory dwelling units, except potentially to repeal the owner occupancy requirement. And so adding this new piece is a substantive change that we would certainly feel better about sending some sort of notice to allow the appropriate parties to give us feedback and respond. And it's something we can certainly look into perhaps as we're moving forward with other phases of our zoning code audit. There are other opportunities moving forward in this year where we could take a look at that.
Yeah, and that was going to be my point procedurally is it doesn't necessarily have to go as part of this if that's something that the commission would like to look at. Excuse me. At the not jeopardizing, you know, any sort of momentum or any sort of you know, progress that's been made on this package. This could certainly be taken as proposed, and then the addition of the manufactured dwellings added later if that was the commission's desire. You know, and I'll note additionally that we have, you know, a July 1st deadline for implementation of some of these, and so it would certainly be staff's recommendation that you consider this package at this time.
July 1st of what year?
2018.
Oh, you mean a month ago?
No. All right.
We're behind the curve at the moment.
Right, Martha?
Yeah, that was my understanding, is that if we move ahead today, so we have either two choices. We either move ahead and accept this, or we do an extension and try and work on the other policy. For me, it's 6 of one, half dozen of another. I think it would be more thoughtful as we think this through to move ahead with what we have before us, and then take a look at that in more depth and notice people. Because I think the notice thing is the stickler for me, is if we're going to make that kind of change. But this will get us started on the right pathway. So okay. I'm not against changing it, by the way. I actually think, I'm glad that Commissioner Savas has picked up on this, and we need to take a closer look at it.
Okay.
Well, I mean, I'm not adverse to the approach that Martha suggested, but I think that we should consider, we should consider that, because I think that the conference that we attended, it was pretty clear that a number of the vendors that were there were displaying manufactured units, and that seemed to be the thrust of what's taking place regionally and at the state level. And for us to basically, by some of our current things, restrict that to where that wouldn't be allowed, then doesn't seem to be the legislative nor the regional intent. Just want to give all an FYI to my colleagues on the dais here that that's something I'd just be concerned about.
But right now, there's no one who allows manufactured homes as ADUs. Isn't that what I heard you say?
That's correct. I don't want to be a spokesperson for other jurisdictions' development codes, but I was not able to find an instance where a jurisdiction in the metro region would allow a manufactured dwelling, as we define them, to serve as an accessory dwelling unit. Specifically, Portland and Happy Valley require the ADU to meet Oregon Residential Specialty Code, and I clarified with our Building Codes Department that that standard would not allow manufactured dwellings as we allow them. Milwaukee and Gladstone have certain design standards related to ADUs that I think could preclude most manufactured dwellings from being able to qualify. But I didn't find a jurisdiction in the metro region that would allow manufactured dwellings to serve as ADUs.
Okay, all right, let's move on.
Yeah, the fifth proposal of this package relates to the single-family residential zones up in the Mount Hood area. I mentioned that the zoning and development ordinance already allows accessory dwelling units in the HR district, the Hoodland Residential District. However, the county's ADU regulations in Section 839 don't apply to ADUs up there. Right now, there is no maximum square footage requirement, for example. There is no owner occupancy requirement for ADUs, but only in the HR district. So this proposal includes a recommendation to amend the code to apply the same ADU standards that we have in other zones to ADUs in the HR zone. It also recommends allowing ADUs in the MRR district, which is another single-family or another zone in the Mount Hood area that allows detached single-family housing outright. So we recommend allowing it there and subject to the same Section 839 standards. Finally, there's a proposal to adopt the option authorized by recent state legislation to allow what we're calling accessory historic dwellings. These are different than accessory dwelling units in a couple of ways. Importantly, these dwellings would only be allowed outside of urban growth boundaries and outside of urban reserves, and only in zones where detached single-family housing is allowed outright. So again, not our resource zones, EFU, timber, and ag forest. In order to implement this option, staff is recommending amending the code to include a new Section 843, and that would apply what the state's requirements are for exercising this option. These are those requirements. In order for a property to convert a historic dwelling they have on their property, one that was built between 1850 and 1945, their property must be at least 2 acres in size. It must be zoned FF10, FU10, RA1, RA2, RR, or RRFF5. And it can only be converted to an accessory structure at the time that somebody is building a new primary dwelling on the same property. The state allows for the historic dwelling to be remodeled, to be improved, and even expanded up to 120% of its existing size, but the state option would not allow the historic structure to be replaced if it was ever destroyed. So that is the last element of this package. Here is a map that just shows roughly where some of those properties that may qualify are in the county. You can see them somewhat in yellow, and these properties have the applicable zoning. They appear to be of sufficient size, and our records show they might have a dwelling on them that is old enough to qualify. So it gives you a spatial representation of how this proposal might impact the county. Just briefly, some of the significant issues that may be out there. First, with regards to the owner occupancy requirement, There's discussion about the fairness and the equity of that policy. We've heard people ask, why don't we have an owner occupancy requirement, for example, for duplexes, but we do for an accessory dwelling unit. Repealing the owner occupancy requirement may allow for more rental options in the county. There may be limitations on the county's ability currently to enforce the owner occupancy requirement. Once they sign the deed restriction, we don't necessarily know that they're not renting it out. That said, repealing the owner occupancy requirement, there are concerns that that could have effect on the neighborhood's character. More absentee landowners, for example, might create different impacts. We have heard too that the owner occupancy requirement might be a barrier to some people in deciding whether or not to build an ADU. But from staff's experience, at least, we haven't encountered that much, if at all, from speaking to property owners. With regards to the accessory historic dwelling proposal, the proposal seems to help preserve older homes, again, provide more rental options and more housing options for extended family on the property. There might be concerns about the fairness and the equity of it, again, because it only allows this if you have a dwelling built within a certain date range and in certain areas of the county. There's also not really clear policy intent, at least to staff in the Planning Commission, for the measure in the first place, but it's something that I think is consistent with what the county's trying to do in terms of housing. Finally, with regards to increasing the allowed size of an accessory dwelling unit, the Planning Commission recommended increasing the size to provide greater flexibility. The range of the maximum allowed size in the Portland metro area is between 400 square feet in Gladstone to 1,000 square feet in Happy Valley. Most jurisdictions in the area and in the state are somewhere around 800 square feet. So at the Planning Commission hearing that we had on June 25th, there was limited testimony with this proposal, and neither of the individuals who spoke had clear opposition to it. I already mentioned that the Planning Commission recommended increasing the maximum size and that the county allow manufactured dwellings to serve as ADUs, but only in certain rural residential areas inside of urban growth boundaries. So staff recommends approval of ZDO 269 as it's been drafted, specifically with these 6 proposals. Any other questions for me? Happy to answer to them. Otherwise, thank you for listening to me ramble my first time.
So I have a couple, and one would be, do the existing restrictions on property lines still apply? So you have to be 10 feet from the neighbor's property line, those all still apply?
Yes.
Can we restrict can we do a minimum lot size within the UGB? Because we can't. Because, I mean, if you have a 2,000 square foot lot and you've got a small house on it or something, could you build an ADU? Probably not, because you still have the lines from the neighbor, the distance from the neighbor and the front and access and all those other things. So that doesn't apply. I think the greatest restriction in the other, the historic one is the fact that there are a lot of houses out there that have been built to replace the house that they used to live in years ago that are sitting there, which doesn't open up any more opportunity until you build a house. And that applies to me specifically. And that's one of the problems I have. I mean, I can think of up the road at least 10 houses that were built 5 years ago that have a house sitting on the property that they can't do anything with. So for me, that's a unfairness issue. But Sonia.
So I'm wondering about the owner occupancy requirement, and I'm curious about any thoughts regarding now that we live in a world with Airbnb and we have a high interest in folks visiting Clackamas County in certain areas of the county that are high for tourism. I'm wondering about any thought to, if you remove that, would these accessory dwelling units be able to be run as businesses for Airbnb? And was anybody ever consider that, think about that, look at those impacts? Any thought of requiring maybe, you can rent them out, but they can't be short-term rentals if there were going to be both of them, or what conversations have happened?
We don't allow Airbnbs in Clackamas County. That's true.
But they do exist.
They exist.
So I'm just curious where the conversation has been and the best thinking around this as we change in our technology too, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. There's nothing in this proposal that would change the current county prohibitions on operating short-term accommodations in residential areas without a home occupation permit for, say, a bed and breakfast. So the same, whether you have an accessory dwelling unit on the property or not, whether or not you can have a rent out your space for Airbnb, same standards would apply. It's my understanding that there has been some discussion about addressing short-term rentals as a policy in the county, and perhaps this can be brought up as part of that later, but it's not been addressed specifically with this package.
Okay, so currently we don't allow them, even though they happen. It's something that we probably don't enforce, but they're not allowed. And if we do address that as we deal with our housing affordability crisis, I just get concerned of our goal is to create more units, but if all those units could then be turned into short-term rentals, I think that's a challenge. My daughter lives in Silver Lake, California, and you can go online in her neighborhood and you can get an Airbnb right every time anywhere real close to her, and the impacts on the neighborhood are extraordinary with the Airbnbs that are in California. So I just want to be thinking ahead and make sure that we're conscious of some of these decisions that we make having impacts in that regard.
And I think those are all really good comments and fair statements. As part of the planning department's work program for this fiscal year that you all have adopted, there is a project specifically to look at issues around vacation rentals, short-term rentals, Airbnb, and this certainly will come up in that conversation, and hopefully we'll be able to clarify regulations.
Okay, so anything that we adopt today, we could clarify related to Airbnbs at that time?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, so let's see. Oh, Paul.
So getting back to this owner occupancy, you mentioned it in one of your last slides, and you had the slide up there. Maybe it'd be a good idea to put it back up there. I just want to get closure on that, because I think at least some people out there watching this right now might be confused. So are we saying that an ADU must be owner occupied today, currently?
The way the ADU does not need to be owner occupied, but either the primary dwelling unit or the ADU needs to be occupied by the owner of the subject property.
Okay, so we're not disallowing it, because obviously, the owner can't live in both, right? The owner's going to live in one.
Yeah.
So the restriction, just for clarification, is that it's either or, that the owner of the property must reside in one of the dwellings.
That's current law.
That's the current rule.
And we're
Yep.
changing it.
Proposal
We are
says that
changing it, or we're not changing it? No, I think
We
what you're
are
saying is.
changing it.
Are changing it.
Yes.
Staff recommending, and the Planning Commission is recommending, to repeal the requirement that we have right now that the owner of a property reside in either the primary or the accessory dwelling unit.
Okay, so it could be that it's, the owner could be in a different state, and neither of the two. Okay, I want to make, that
Yeah.
wasn't said in your presentation. I want to make sure that, so it's no longer a significant issue, it's actually a change. A proposal.
It's a repeal.
Yeah, it's a significant proposal, and one where I think that there's, some good views on both sides, and so want to make sure that both sides of those are mentioned, that there is concerns about it.
Okay, and my last thing is that, is there any, and I know maybe this is not the place, but do we anticipate further work in SDC adjustments and permitting costs that will bring the cost of those ADUs down in a more appropriate fashion?
It's up to us.
That certainly is not in my bailiwick with planning, but maybe Martha has any more words to say about it?
The zoning ordinance does not, isn't the isn't the area where the system development charges are implemented out of. That's actually a completely separate document and a separate division. And I don't know if there's any plans to take a look at that.
Yeah, at least once a year, the board adopts fees and reviews the fee table. That's part of what the SDCs are incorporated in, and so it doesn't mean that you can't look at it on a more frequent basis. I saw Dan Johnson in here earlier, so that's something good for him to put on his radar, but that would be the mechanism.
That makes perfect sense. So as the professionals in this field, which you all are, and we are not up here, my question to you is there anything we can do today that will lessen the financial burden and help incentivize the building or property owners from adding an ADU? Is there any restriction here or addition we can add that would ease the entry level into these?
I think that there are things that could make developing an ADU on a property easier. It's just a matter of weighing the potential impacts of that. You know, we could reduce certain requirements for ADUs in many ways, but, you know, weighing the downsides of those.
Can you give me an example of what we could do that would?
I can.
Yeah.
12 stories.
I'm gonna jump in here. So before I answer that, I can tell you that we have been working on this for a while, and we have already made amendments to our zoning code to allow for reduced rear setbacks for ADUs to provide more flexibility for people. One of the things we might consider moving forward as we are, again, moving through the next phase of our ZDO audit, we're going to be tackling section 1015, which talks about parking. There's currently a requirement for one parking space behind the front building line, which means you can't count your parking space in the driveway. That's something that's going to come up, I think, it has come up in other jurisdictions that is perhaps too restrictive. We have not run into any issues here, but that's certainly a conversation we can have around both single-family homes and accessory dwelling units. We're not proposing to change that right now because that's just what has always been in our, or not always, but since we've allowed ADUs, been in our zoning ordinance. It's things like that. We've tried to, over the years, as we're looking at our zoning code, do what we can to allow enough flexibility for people to come in and build ADUs. There's no planning fee associated with coming in and building an accessory dwelling unit, so there's nothing we can do on our end there. I can tell you that currently, for system development charges for transportation and parks, the ADUs are being charged a reduced rate. They're not charged the regular single-family rate. They're charged the apartment rate. So there is some effort made there. And, I mean, certainly we can continue to talk about it, but there certainly are impacts associated with it, and so the SDC conversation is going to have to happen sometime in the future.
So that 0.8 was like, that apartment comparison was like 0.8 SDC approximate, is that what I recall?
I can't remember off the
Instead of
top of my
being
head. I
100%
might have the
SDC
numbers
charges,
scribbled on my
80%
notebook
of
here.
SDC charges?
Yeah, it looks like it's about 3/4 of the rate of a single-family dwelling, but don't quote me on that number.
Good friends do.
All right. Okay, everybody, oh, Ken.
Just a quick process question. And by the way, thank you very much for the time you spent with me going over this. I appreciated that. It helped answer a lot of questions in advance. If we were to remove any one of the individual 6 proposals, does that prevent us from going forward and immediately implementing the balance of the proposals?
No.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we will open the public hearing. And I see we have one person here representing the hamlet of Beaver Creek. So you're up first, and you have, I guess, 3 minutes, just like everybody else. So, Joan, you might as well come up too. Welcome.
Good morning.
Name and where you live.
Good morning. My name is Bill Merchant, and I live in Beaver Creek. I'm the vice chairman of the Hamlet of Beaver Creek. The Hamlet of Beaver Creek appreciates that you have to do a lot of the things that the state tells you to do. And so we do not oppose the thing. The clerk's handing out a letter that we've prepared for you. And I don't want to read the letter to you because you can all read yourself, I know. I wanted to just talk about the things that are important to the Hamlet of Beaver Creek, since we are outside the UGB, but very close to the UGB. And since we have a good bit of the yellow areas on that map that illustrate what's happening outside of what would be impacted outside of the UGB. Our concerns are the size of changing the size of the ADU so that, you know, we think that the current restrictions on ADU size are pretty good for our unurban area. We think that if we get too much bigger, it's going to impact how neighborhoods are. One of the other concerns is about the ADUs for older homes. There are a lot of old homes around in our area, and they don't meet code. They are really out of code. And some of them have very poor insulation, some have them poor wiring from 1945. You know, you remember, maybe you don't remember what things were like in 45, but it was not very good. And we're concerned that if that proposal goes through to allow those to be turned into ADUs, if they're not improved, they're a hazard. And you could put your family in them, but you'd be putting them at risk when you built the new house. And that's a concern that just that might happen. The other thing that Commissioner Fisher pointed out is there are a lot of rental units in the county. And in our area, some of them are mobile homes, some of them are campers, some of them are a bus that just got parked in the backyard. And that's a problem for us in general. When we compound that by adding ADUs that are being used as rentals, the state has laws about rental properties. The county doesn't really, except for the home occupation permit for like a bed and breakfast, and those are not very well enforced. I'll be generous and say they're not very well enforced. So we're afraid that if we have a lot of ADUs built in the rural areas, those will become rental units. And if we restrict the owner occupancy part and we remove that and say that they can both be rental units now, we're afraid that we're going to have a lot of problems that we don't have as much of now, but they might really increase. And so those are the two major concerns that we have. The other general concern is that a lot of these new developments would be on private roads. In the rural areas, there are a lot of private roads that run into county roads, but the private roads don't get anything from SDCs. So if we build a lot more accessory dwelling units and they're using private roads to get to the county road can be improved, but the private road just gets more traffic, and the owners of the private road, the homeowners, don't get any benefit from having somebody build ADUs in their neighborhood. So that's another concern that we have. Just putting it out there for you.
All right.
And if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Any questions?
Yeah, I have one.
Go ahead.
So what would you suggest about the owner occupancy? If you were sitting up here as a commissioner, what would be your suggestion to us?
My suggestion would be keeping the owner occupancy in the rural area. In the urban areas, I can see where you need more flexibility. But in the rural area, when you have a property that has 2 dwelling units on it, it might be a real problem. So my suggestion would be to just restrict the removal to the urban areas.
That basically, for clarification, that one of the 2 dwelling units be owner occupied.
Yes.
That's correct.
One of the 2 would be owner occupied in rural areas.
And the argument is it's impossible to enforce.
It is, I understand that, but, you know, if the argument is that it's impossible to enforce, why do we have laws anyway?
That's right.
Everybody drives faster than 55 on the freeway, that's for sure.
That's true.
All right. Okay. Joan?
Joan Zuber, 44731 South Elk Prairie Road, Molalla. I'm vice chair of the South Clackamas CPO, but I think our chair is traveling, so we didn't get any notice. But I have some real concerns. I think that you need to take a closer look at some parts of this. As far as the historic home, I agree with a lot of what you said, and the fact that they are not energy efficient. So do we want to open that up to possibly have as a rental? I don't know. I just don't think I don't think it's a good idea because of the code and because of the lack of updated efficiency. And then, fortunately, I live in a timber zone, so a lot of these things don't personally affect me. But urban growth boundaries can change. And so what you're looking at right now for an urban growth boundary could expand. And there are some areas that, and I'm thinking specifically south of Molalla, which there is a water-restricted, limited zone that they really cannot have, they have to have 5-acre lots at least, because they don't want to be dipping into the area where they may be pumping out all the groundwater. So if you have a ADU that's added to this, does that mean drilling another well when it's supposed to be staying to the 5-acre lot size? Maybe for an ADU in any of these areas, that it should be where you have public water and not depending on wells. So anyway, those would be probably my biggest concerns over this.
Thank you. I have a question on the, when you remodel a home, there's a spot you hit where you have to update things, and what is that? So if you spend so much money on it, you have to do an update, or does anyone know?
We would have to check with building codes to find that out. I don't know that answer.
Okay.
And you could be doing upgrade yourself.
Yeah, you do it yourself. You still have to have them inspected, though.
Some you do, some you don't.
Electrical, you definitely do.
Yes, electrical, yes, you do.
And plumbing. Yeah, and framing, actually, and most of those you do. Okay, so Paul.
Yeah, so I got a question for staff. I mean, I think the concerns and the arguments for the owner occupancy issue are valid, but I think they're just as valid in the urban area as they are the rural area, but for different reasons, okay, as Bill articulated. And so my question is there a deed restrict? I mean, let's just say the property sells, you build an ADU, it's owner occupied, and it sells. Is there something in the deed compelling that person to live in that home, ADU, or tear it down in the event that they don't live it and they want to use it as a rental property? What does a person with the intent of buying the property for rental with an ADU there have by virtue of what we're doing here today? Well, it doesn't have the deed restriction currently, but if it did, how would that be enforced or conveyed to the new owner?
The deed restriction that we require be recorded with the deed to the property before we issue a building permit for the new ADU would ride with the property. And we would not authorize the removal of the deed restriction until we have evidence that the ADU itself was removed.
Okay.
You know, I've got one other thing I'd like to say is that when you have property, you live in a zone, and you're expecting that if you have a rural residential 5-acre, 10-acre, whatever, that it isn't possibly going to change and become more populous. And so I think that I think there's a potential to have too many people moving into an area, and then you have an increase in the population, increase in traffic. So that's something else to look at. If you have a zoning and it's 5 acres, is it going to be then where you have 2 people on that, two households?
It's gonna happen anyway, it's just gonna take longer, Paul.
So I'm really concerned about neighborhood impacts, whether they're rural or urban. And I don't want my comments in any way to be misconstrued here today when I talk about, or it seems to be that I'm advocating for manufactured housing. But on one hand, I am, but I want to clarify what I mean by that. And that manufactured housing, in the terms that I'm speaking to, would be something that would be new, that would meet current manufactured housing standards. And those are vastly improved to what something used to be in the past. I'm not talking about things with wheels underneath them. I'm talking about manufactured housing that is, affordable, well-built, meets HUD requirements. I think they have a 60-year lifespan. So with that said, my concern would be is that if someone's made the expense of building making a $80,000 to $100,000 investment into building an ADU on their property, and they were to tear that down, that's gone. If it was a manufactured housing, it would be potentially reusable or movable to another site. So there's not a complete economic loss. It shouldn't be a disincentive. So I think that's why careful consideration of how that is done, if you implement a owner occupancy requirement, that be a factor, because that could be not only a disincentive, well, it is a disincentive, but it could be multiple disincentives, not just one.
Okay, Sonia?
So I'm just wondering, the comment that Joan made about water, and if you have an accessory dwelling unit, do you need to build an additional well, and what impact does that have? Was curious if I could get some perspective on that.
Certainly. I'll reiterate that the accessory dwelling unit element of this proposal is state mandated inside of urban growth boundaries. So those areas that have already been planned for urbanization. The package also recommends allowing accessory dwelling units in more areas up in the Mount Hood area, because those areas have urban services, generally piped water and sewer services. Separate from the accessory dwelling unit discussion, there's this accessory historic home provision that applies outside of urban growth boundaries. And the siting of the new primary dwelling on the property, which is a requirement for converting the accessory historic home to an accessory dwelling, will have the same requirements. The new primary dwelling will have to be hooked up to services, or have a septic system, or have a well. And the minimum lot size requirement for this provision, 2 acres in size, may help to accommodate concerns about too much density of these structures and drawing on water supply.
I'm just going to also throw in there that wells are regulated through the state. There is not they could certainly share a well. That is allowed if it meets the state's standards. And in most instances in the county, you're allowed to drill a new domestic well. There is a groundwater limited area south of Malala, and I believe that's what Joan was referring to. And I don't know specifically how that affects the drilling of new wells. But if I could just throw out there, maybe domestic wells are exempt from getting water rights, and there's some sort of volume that you're required to have. I don't know what it is, but if you could hook a 1 or 2 bedroom ADU up to, you could hook a new dwelling potentially up to the same well as the old dwelling. Or you could build a new dwelling that's 3 times the size of a new dwelling, of the old dwelling. And so I think that in terms of domestic use, it's not an incredibly large impact to add another dwelling to the property, only because it's not every property that's going to qualify. And there's no specific limitation on the size of the new dwelling you could build. Rather than keep the old dwelling, you could build an enormously large new dwelling. And I think that it would potentially use the same amount of water. I'm not articulating this correctly, but does
No, I
that make
think
any
you're
sense?
actually being very helpful. I just don't have in my knowledge base how these types of changes would impact, and water's very important, wanting to make sure that we're not making decisions that could hurt, I know that we're not in charge of the water, but the decisions we make for land use, there's effects. So I just want to make sure that we will not be overtaxing a system, or that there are just certain safeguards in place if a system were to be overtaxed, or if that's something that we as commissioners need to look at and advocate with our partners at the state level, so.
Is there a requirement for testing the flow before a building permit would be issued if if the well is going to be shared?
I don't have the answer to that. I'd have to check with building codes.
Because
I don't think so.
I believe that there's also a water restricted area that's up in the Sandy area, and also Damascus Boring. There's some areas in there.
There are a few areas in the county that are groundwater limited, you're correct.
Stafford used to be.
And
A portion of Stafford used to be.
And so the last thing I'd throw out there also is the reason we had created those maps is to just sort of get a sense for how many properties we're looking at out there. And specifically for the accessory historic dwelling proposal, it's roughly 800 properties that are kind of strewn all across the county. And so I guess our sort of feeling behind that was that the potential impact system-wide is not extraordinarily large. I don't know, for example, how many of those are in the Beaver Creek hamlet specifically, or south of Malala specifically, but just sort of general scale of potential new development if somebody had all the qualifications and then could finance the construction of a new house. We think that certainly through the foreseeable future, the impact is not extraordinarily large.
So this bill was brought forward by Charlotte Lehan. It was amended to put some restrictions on it. Her purpose, legislative intent, was to preserve historic homes. For example, across the street, the guy from my house has a beautiful old home. It'd be a crime to tear that home down, to build another home on his lot. I mean, it really would. I don't know what my home looked like before it was torn down, but it was also historic, built in around turn of 1890s, 80s. I mean, the whole purpose was to save historic homes. I mean, that's it. And they're not necessarily registered historic homes, but that's the purpose of it. Ken?
Yeah, having lived on a well for about 25 years, actually 2 wells, because that's what it took, maybe I can provide a little insight. Even if you wanted to build another house on a lot, if you have a low production well, then and you figure 5 to 10 gallons a minute of production will get you by in a single family home with a little bit of landscaping, not very much. To build a second home, your production ability is going to be critical. So unless you have a well that's a higher producing well, it'd be very unlikely to be able to build a second dwelling. The only exception to that would be a large storage tank. And then that's what kind of storage tank you use is going to depend on terrain. You're either going to have a big pressure tank, or you're going to put a big tank up on a hill so you can get gravity feed. I mean, those are the practical aspects of what you're going to deal with a well. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about somebody building an extra house on a 5-acre parcel protecting an old rural home unless that well production was pretty significant.
Well, the area south of Malala is called Glad Tidings Restricted.
So those practical considerations are going to have an impact.
Let's not respond from the guy up there to his answer, I guess, and let's ask, so we could be here all day. So it was Paul and then Martha.
Yeah, getting back to the owner-occupied issue, I think there's another factor we need to consider, and just having experience in that regard, is that owner-occupied properties, whether there's an ADU on it or not, are typically typically, not always, more well-maintained, more well-kept, and, you know, and in a sense that there would be an ADU on it, and the owner being owner-occupied, there would be probably a tendency to be right on top of any issues that arise, and the quality of life in that neighborhood or that property would be enhanced. So I'm leaning that way. On the historic side, I guess, unless there's more clarification, I totally understand what you're saying, Jim, and maybe what the intent was in that somehow that the structure may be in disrepair, as, you know, I think Bill was in the letter alluded to, may in disrepair. It's not necessarily means that it should be torn down for preservation, but it also shouldn't be a situation where in disrepair that it should automatically be occupied, being in disrepair, because there could be a number of safety issues that could impact the welfare of anyone residing in there. So I have concerns about that. And my other comment as far as the water, and I guess I just kind of, knowing that our biggest abuse of the water table right now is being incurred by the marijuana factor. That's what's killing us right now as far as the water table. But on that topic of marijuana, you could have in an EFU setting, even an urban setting, an allowance to even, let's just say in the urban setting, you can grow, 6 plants, I believe, on a property. You put a second property there, that owner has a right, the dweller of that ADU has a right to, whether they own or not, for their marijuana crop. Different setting and different limits, but we're potentially expanding the need for more water and all the negative elements that some folks are experiencing on the marijuana aspect as well. So I think we really need to be really thoughtful about what we're doing here, and I'm thinking we ought to be a little bit, in some ways, more conservative, absent more definition about what we're doing today.
Martha.
So I just want to address the historic piece of this, because we do have an inventory of historic homes throughout this county. I don't know if it's been codified, if it's electronic at this point. I think it is, because I remember Pam Hayden and Peggy Sigler pulling that together, and I'd be curious to see the number of those 800 properties that might be under that, assessment and designation. It was a Goal 5 process identifying the resource. So in that case, if they are significant, does the county still give a tax break for a historic structure for 15 years if it's designated as a national trust property?
I wish I knew the answer to that. I don't know.
Because in other words, there may be incentives out there for the older properties to be preserved, as well as build another home. And one of the purposes of this inventory that we did when we were doing this in the heyday of the early 2003 and 5, we were still working on these kinds of things. One of the purposes was to identify those, rural and urban, and give incentives for restoration and increasing energy efficiencies, to do those upgrades, to do those kinds of things. So I understand there's the concern you could have, but there's also some potential benefits that I think we should think about. And I speak from personal experience because I restored a 1910 farmhouse windmill and a 1904 barn. And is it particularly ever up to code in quite the same way? Probably not, but you can do those kinds of efficiencies and actually get incentives to do not only preserving the building, but actually getting energy incentives. So it's not necessarily a bad thing.
Of course, they don't have to be registered to be historic.
No, we actually had two things. There are some that are on the National Register, then we have a Clackamas County Historic Inventory as well. And the historic inventory from Clackamas County doesn't necessarily mean that it's a National Trust property. But that's information that we might want to try and look at because of this, 1850 to 1945. And I think now, I can't remember what the years are when you can actually start designating something a National Trust property. I actually believe it's actually moved into any homes in the 50s, 60s, and 70s at this point. Is it 50 years?
think so.
Yeah, so.
Grover? Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Grover, you're up.
Hello, everyone. My name is Grover Bornefeld, and I'm a 27-year resident of Clackamas County in Jennings Lodge area. And I'd like to start by thanking you all. I so appreciate the direction that we're all moving in. So I appreciate that the Planning Commission was so open to comments. I was a commenter at that event. And then I also really want to appreciate the staff's response to that, which for me is clearly moving in the direction that has us all working together. And I regularly thank you all for your support of the citizens. I am a member of the Jennings Lodge CPO board, and I'm here speaking for myself, but they are aware that I'm here speaking. I'm going to speak to the cause, like Paul did, and that the whole reason this is coming up is affordable housing supply. There is an insufficient. I mean, the statistics I heard is that 40% of the people who live in the greater Portland metropolitan area cannot afford a one-bedroom place to live. That's huge. Okay, so will this solve that problem? No, but until we add, solely no, but until we add to the supply, it will continue to be an ongoing problem. And that we have somewhere less than a 3% vacancy rate also adds to that issue. So that's why costs are so high. It's the affordability, though, that I really want to speak to. I'm retired now. All the plans and everything else, when we moved here, my property taxes were under $1,000. We're getting almost to $5,000 a month. I mean, excuse me, a year. It is, yeah, okay, what the heck. I was just seeing into the future. That's the problem. I don't want to go there. Anyway, my point is, this is an opportunity to have homeowners, not developers. Because, I mean, all around me, I watch all these R10s, and most of them, my property's bigger than 10,000 square feet, but all around where I live, our zoning's being chunked down, chunked down, chunked down. We are all here to have a moment of silence for the Evangelical Retreat Center, which is now finally permitted to go forward. The trees are going to start coming down, the buildings are going to come down, and they went down to 8.5. That's 3 blocks from my house. My point is, we can't. I live almost 10 miles from downtown Portland, and yet it's growing. And so I have empathy for the people in Beaver Creek and Malala, but it's going to be out there as well. So we can't protect that, but we can at least protect the quality of life and the affordability. So for me to build an ADU on my property, to do it at 720 square feet, just the costs are prohibitive. At least at 900 square feet, you'll get more use out of it. But I want to address the thing about owner occupancy, because I actually have a concern about that as well. I'd like us to look at what Portland did. They just changed their rules over there, from my understanding. You only get the waiver on SDCs if you maintain owner occupancy. If in, I think it's a 10-year time period, if you give up the owner occupancy, you have to repay all the waived SDCs. Now, I understand that that's not in your bailiwick, and for me, my biggest SDC, if I did one, would be the Oak Lodge Water Services District. That's half of the $20,000 in fees that it would cost to build. Now, instead of a 720 square feet, it'd be a 900 square feet. So for me, it's at least getting closer to affordable, but it's not in of itself solving it. And I think I covered everything on my list. Yes. Oh, I did want to comment. I wish I could build for $80,000 to $100,000 an ADU. I think the building costs have run away from that. Because to do even a 900 square feet, it's be $111 a square foot. And when I price it, it doesn't seem to come in that way. I need to find the right builder, because I'm not going to do it all myself. That's all I wanted to say. Again, thank you all for the direction we're headed.
I've got a question. So you mentioned $1,100 a square foot, so 700 square feet would be about $7,800. Just doing some math in my head. Or $78,000, doing the math in my head. So I want to make sure you're 1,100. Did you shop that, or is that just an estimate?
No, I just took 720 square feet and divided it by 100,000, and that's $138 a square foot.
No, you mentioned the $111
That would be
a
for
square
900
foot.
square feet at,
Oh, so you took my numbers and derived 1,100.
I just took the 900 square feet and I said 100,000, that's $111 a square foot. I haven't found anybody who will build for $111 a square
Okay,
foot.
thank you.
That's what
That
I'm saying.
clarifies where that came from. So
Yeah.
what is the cost? Anyone know what the cost per square foot is to build? right
Everywhere
now?
I look for ADUs, it's $150 to $200 a square foot.
Okay. That's what I was looking for. Thank
You
you.
can get a guy to show up.
Exactly. Yeah, what's it, yesterday's paper headline is, building is slowed because there's not enough workers.
Yep.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Well, with that, I'll close the public portion of the hearing, and the board will now, I guess, deliberate. So, I happen to think that historic homes, yeah, by the way, my house would not apply to this. I mean, what I'd like to say does not apply. So I feel free that I can, there are a lot of farms out there. Now, of course, a lot of those probably sold to marijuana growers. But there are a lot of properties out there that people are struggling to keep. And I think this gives another opportunity for the family to preserve their farm, their property, by allowing them to build another home. Oftentimes, that'll be the person living in it might be a worker, might be a grandmother, might be somebody they know, but it's an opportunity to preserve the family farm. So for me, I think that's important. So that's why I think the historic home aspect. Now, I can drive up the road and see historic homes that have been empty for a long time, but it doesn't apply. They still have to tear them down. I'd like to see that change. I'd like to see them be able to preserve their historic homes as well as build. And it doesn't matter, I mean, it does matter when they were built, but it doesn't have to be concurrent with a new home. I'd like to see that. Owner occupancy, I just think it's impossible. I actually like your idea. I think the SDC reduction is a really good way to control that. Put it as a lien on the property, that if the property owner leaves, then they would have to pay that. That's a really good incentive to, be owner occupied. I like that better. And rather than, so I'd like to consider repealing the owner occupancy, but somehow tie it to that SDC thing. The problem is that a lot of times this stuff takes time. So you get 500 applicants before we do the tie the SDC reduction to that. It's too late. And that could easily happen. I mean, marijuana is a great example of what's going on. We can't do the laws before someone thinks of a way around it, and then it's too late. So that's the challenge for me on that. But so I mean, I'd like to maybe consider leaving the owner occupancy there for now, and then go to, when we get to the discussion about SDC charges, figure out a way we could do that. I like the 5-10 year, whatever. I still think it's impossible to regulate unless it's on the title. And anyway, so Ken.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The owner occupancy one was the question that came up in my mind when I met with staff on this, and I was not going to bring it up myself. What I wanted to do was find out if that struck anyone else. And clearly it did, both in this commission and from what I heard from the audience. And so whether we go forward with this or we give direction to staff to come back with some modifications that include some of the things you were talking about, I would like to maintain the owner occupancy requirement. We don't know the entire impacts in real world terms that this whole proposal is going to have on the livability in neighborhoods. So a cautious approach, I think at this point in time, might be the way to go. If it doesn't have a dramatic negative impact on the livability of communities, we can revisit the issue of owner occupancy requirements in the future. But I think we better serve the community and some of the concerns I've heard here today by removing that recommendation from the proposal. So that's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Paul?
So, well, knowing that if we maintain the owner occupancy and knowing all the other issues, it sounds like this is really a two-part, we do what we need to do today to meet the requirement, the mandate, and then we can come back and make some adjustments and have more time to think this through. So I'm willing to support, as I kind of mentioned earlier, I was kind of alluding to the concept of the owner occupancy requirement and not repealing it as is currently defined. But I do also want to look at in order to really meet the intent and the requirement, look at a better definition of one that we could all agree with and live with, for maintaining a high quality, an option for a high quality manufactured type allowance, but that's not something we can do here today. I don't want that to be construed as, someone rolling in a trailer or a camper,
Yeah.
and that falling under the definition of manufactured housing. I know that's not what we're doing, but I just want to make sure that one aspect of that high quality requirement have enough definition around it, at least for public consumption standpoint sake, that people know that we're not talking about rolling in old trailers and having that as an ADU.
Okay.
Make sure that's perfectly understood.
Yeah, Sonia?
So just a question, I'm noodling Bill's comments about the size, 720 to 900. And I just want to make sure I've got this right in my head. So what is the smallest lot size that would be affected?
Yeah, this proposal only affects properties who have, the smallest minimum lot size of the affected properties is 5,000 square feet. Is that correct?
Oh, is it? Oh, I thought if you could fit it and the setbacks were still okay, then you could build it. If you couldn't probably build a 900 square foot one in a smaller lot, but you could build a smaller one. Isn't that true? I don't remember the 5,000.
So I guess, and I did say yes, the distinction probably is the zoning district that allows the smallest lot sizes is the R5 zone, which has a 5,000 square foot lot size for density calculations. We allow flexible lots within that if you're dividing, so you actually could have a lot that's a little bit smaller than that. But the R5 zone would be the zoning district that allows the smallest lot sizes, that would have the 900 square foot maximum. We have two other urban zoning districts that allow smaller lots, like 2,500 square feet or even 2,000 square feet. And we're not proposing to change that. It's not something that was put out for proposal, and that was not something that was discussed at the Planning Commission. Currently, there's a 500 square foot maximum for ADUs in those zones, and practically speaking, those are the ones where they would be lucky to fit 500 square feet with setbacks and lot coverage requirements and things like that.
Sonia, you were still asking a
Oh, yes,
question.
I was.
Finish
Thank you.
it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I'm not necessarily that good at visual thinking of this is this big and this is that big. So I'm a little bit challenged in that area. But it seems to me that a 5,000 square foot lot, when you already have a house and you're putting something that could be 900 square feet, like that's a lot of space on one plot of land. And so I'm just wondering, and I don't know, I'm just throwing this out there, if we would want to, if that's true, if we would want to say on this size lot, you can go up to 720 square feet. If it's over this size of lot, you can go up to 900. I'm just throwing it out there, if that would make sense, but I don't know, so.
And so you're correct. We have other regulations in our zoning code that would, in some ways, limit the size that you could put the size of an ADU that you could put on a 5,000 square foot lot. For example, you can't cover more than 40% of your lot with the footprint of your structures, and so that is 2,000 square feet. And so if you have a 1,500 square foot single-story house, you're not going to be able to get a 900 square foot ADU unless you're going up and attaching it to your house or something. So between the setbacks and the lot coverage, it does speak a little bit to that just total, the sort of the visual, you know, having too much structure on your property, I guess. That's what you're talking about.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You know what would be helpful sometimes too is I'd like to know how many square feet is in this room, so you can actually visualize. I think this is about 2,100 square feet if
Why don't you tape the floor?
huh?
Let's go walk it out.
Yeah, we should measure this out so you have a visual example of the size of a lot.
I got within a foot usually.
But this, I mean, if I look at my barn, it's longer than this, but not as wide. It's close to 2,500, somewhere around there.
About 2,000, just
I
a
think
guess.
it's a little
just a
bigger than
hunch.
that, but anyway, just for the heck of it.
Martha?
Yeah, I just want to thank colleagues for your comments. I also kind of feel that the owner occupancy piece should remain the same, because we're talking ADUs. It's a little different than someone being a landlord and owning a property off-site. It's really qualitatively, to me, somewhat different. And for instance, I have, I guess I don't know if it's really an ADU, it doesn't have a bathroom or a kitchen, but it has a pull-out bed, and it's just different. It's a different size, scope. Yeah, I do think the owner occupancy worries me, to get rid of that. So I'd be willing to move forward with this with some kind of a motion that directs staff to do that. I'm okay with the older house piece. I do want to say a disclaimer, I no longer own the farm, but my sons do, and they are essentially growing hops, so hopefully there's no conflict with me mentioning the preservation stuff that we did.
So I have an alternative, because the owner occupancy is great, but what if somebody dies?
Yeah.
You're gonna have to tear down how many $1,000 did you spend on that building? You know, $100 and something $1,000 building? I think you should do something like 5 years or something like that. Must be owner occupied for 5 years, because that's a lot of money.
I'd go a little.
You're actually trapped.
I'm fine with that.
You're
Why
actually,
are you trapped?
well, you're trapped, I mean, you just spent $100,000, you lose your job, you have to move. Now you can't sell that, the people who buy it have to
Why
tear
can't-
down 100.
No,
They-
no, no,
they
you,
can
no,
sell
you
it.
could sell it, but the restriction would be that they
Whoever
would,
buys it.
they would be able to live there and have the ADU. They
Yeah.
wouldn't be
Well, that's
able to
true.
be,
What if
be a rental.
I guess that's
Yeah.
true.
I'm willing, I think the next phase of this, Jim, we could maybe have some better discussion around some of the ideas you raised. But I think safely, and moving slowly and conservatively here today, not repealing the owner occupancy is something I would support.
Yeah, me too. Okay. I think we're all in consensus.
All right, let's do a motion. Somebody make a motion.
Chairman?
Yes,
I-
you had something you want to add?
Before you make the motion, it sounds like you're heading down this path, and so we just wanted to bring up one issue really quick on the owner occupancy.
Yeah, and Commissioner Schrader mentioned the being in favor of keeping the regulations the same as they are now. And just to remember, the HR zone in the Mount Hood area does not today have an owner occupancy requirement. And so I don't know if there's a proposal to now require an owner occupancy requirement there. And then if so, I would assume that some properties would be grandfathered in to not having that.
But it's
And we
part
could
of
have a
it.
case where there are some in the HR zone that don't have an owner occupancy requirement because they're grandfathered in, and ones that now would.
Yeah, so why don't we keep it the same with what the current zoning for owner occupancy is
Yeah.
in the county?
Thank you.
So we're not
So-
changing it at all.
Yeah.
Just one more clarifying
We
question.
just don't even bring it up.
Well, then,
May I clarify something also?
Sure.
Are you also potentially proposing to add the owner occupancy requirement to the areas where ADUs will newly be allowed under the legislation, because I don't think that poses a problem for us, correct? Including the historic dwellings?
You said it is a problem or isn't?
That's not a problem. That's not an issue. The only issue would be
Okay.
areas that currently allow ADUs that do not have the owner occupancy requirement.
Maybe another way of wording, I know where you're going, I think, clarify. So in a sense, maybe in order to bring this back, if we wanted to have an owner occupancy requirement, and in number 5 of the proposals, it's not, right, in some of those, right?
I'm sorry, what's number 5?
Number 5 is permit ADUs in MRR and HR, right? So maybe to be consistent, we would actually we would approve today number 1, number 3, number 4, and number 6, and not 5 and 2 and 5, and be consistent and come back and adjust those later. Is that correct?
Well, actually,
Proposal 5 is the recommendation to apply the ADU standards to the single-family residential districts up in the Mount Hood area. That includes the owner occupancy requirement today. There's also a proposal to apply square footage limitations to ADUs up there where they don't apply today. So Proposal 5 includes a recommendation to apply a maximum square footage requirement, as well as expanding where they're allowed.
But they don't currently have in some of those, they don't have the owner occupancy requirement.
That's correct. It's only allowed in the HR zone today, and there is no owner occupancy requirement.
Okay, so is there another way we craft that, either by removal of 5 at a later date, or recraft number 5?
so I think it's actually under number 2, I think, and Nate, correct me, or Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, for the owner occupancy, it would be to retain the owner occupancy where it is currently required and apply owner occupancy to areas where accessory dwelling units are newly allowed,
Correct.
where they were not allowed before, and apply the owner occupancy to the historic accessory dwellings.
Okay,
Does that make sense, Nate?
so you're saying we can do that today?
You can do that today.
Okay, so Nate, could you craft that so we could actually make a motion out of
It's a
that?
very long motion if we can separate those out.
Just say so moved.
What she said?
Yeah, what she said.
That puts the clerk in a difficult spot.
This is recorded. We can go back, they can go back to the recording to get the exact
Well,
language.
all you're doing is you're accepting them all but 2.
With the tweak on 5. They need to make a tweak on number 5, on the HR.
Yeah, and the tweak would be just when we say that we're applying ADU standards to ADUs in the HR zone, that's everything except the owner occupancy requirement, because there's not one there today, if I understand you correctly. But it would be to require owner occupancy in the MRR zone in Mount Hood, because they're not allowed, ADUs are not currently allowed there today.
So the motion could be moved to approve ZDO 269. Well, because does 269 include a repeal?
Yes.
So tell you what, let me make a stab at it, Jim.
Okay.
Let me make a stab at it.
I have to repeat it, so.
Yeah. So I move to approve ZDO 269 with the amendment that we retain the owner occupancy requirement as is in section 839, and also include the owner occupancy requirement in the HR districts.
For any new ADU.
Close, but the HR district currently does not have the owner occupancy. We cannot add it at this hearing, and so let me.
Oh, that's what I thought you said we could do today. That was I thought you said.
You
no,
could
we-
add it to
We
new.
can add it to the areas that we are, excuse me, that we are adding ADUs to now. You can currently have a ADU in the HR district, but it has no owner occupancy requirement. We are adding a whole new.
Okay.
The ability to add to new zones. So let's try this. it sounds like there would be a motion to approve ZDO 269 as proposed by staff and the Planning Commission with the following change. To retain the owner occupancy requirements as they currently exist, to impose owner occupancy requirements for newly created or newly authorized areas for accessory dwelling units, and to impose owner occupancy requirements for those historic accessory dwelling units. I could probably do it more
What he
carefully than
said.
that, but that's the gist
So
of it.
moved.
Second.
I think you have the recording and you wrote down what you could, right?
Yes.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded, what he said. That is that, I'm gonna try to repeat it, okay? That we approve ZDO 269 as recommended by the Planning Commission and staff, with the exception of retaining the owner-occupy requirement in zones where it's currently required, and to add it to the accessory historic dwellings
I think you meant newly
Authorized areas.
Newly authorized.
Newly authorized areas.
and newly authorized areas. Okay? And so let's poll. All those in favor, he's going to poll.
Commissioner Humbertson.
Aye.
Commissioner Fisher.
Aye.
Commissioner Savas.
Aye.
Commissioner Schrader.
Aye.
Chair Bernard.
Aye. I'd like to add that I'd like to come back and talk about what Grover suggested, because I think it's an excellent idea to do
I
that.
think that's a good idea, too.
With additional direction to staff besides that, do we want to ask staff to come back and have us address the HR zones in terms of the owner occupancy requirement? Because if we do, notification is going to be required on that one, because that's a change, if I understood you correctly.
But do we want to change it?
That's my question, because if we do, we need to give direction to staff to prepare that one. You want to talk about that
I
one?
don't necessarily want to do that,
Well,
but we
so,
can talk about it.
yeah,
I just want to make sure it wasn't dropped and floating out there in the ether.
yeah, I propose that staff consider all the things we discussed here today, including that, and as well as the, standards that we might feel comfortable with as regards to manufactured housing, and other things that could reduce the cost. I think one element of that goes back to an owner-occupied dwelling unit that someone adds at $120, $50, or $100 or $200 a square foot. That could be all lost if in the event that there's a restriction that it can't be rented.
Can we do that via work session? So we can
Yeah,
kind
so-
of talk it through with staff?
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe a work session to actually give guidance to maybe another proposal before the planning commission.
Sure, yeah, and I would suggest that's a larger DTD issue. It's not just the Planning and Zoning Division. That would include DTD administration, since they're the ones that typically adopt or propose the different fees, SDCs of which are one.
Okay, so I do have a concluding statement I need. Now that the amendments have been approved, I will direct staff to draft an ordinance reflecting today's decision and include it on an agenda for board adoption at a future business meeting. With that, I'll close the hearing on ZDO 269. Thank you,
And we're adjourned.
and we're adjourned.